During the 16th century, we also begin to see clocks in paintings, usually in portraits of scholarly people, or as some kind of a reminder that time passes and we need to not waste it. This suddenly becomes a really important theme. We see it in Shakespeare. In Twelfth Night, Olivia says, "The clock upbraids me with the waste of time." In the 16th century, we start to see clocks also with skulls carved in them. Yet another reminder of how time passed and we should make the most of every day. It could be argued that clocks, with their constant reminder of our time running up and moving us closer to death, played a small role in the development of humanism around this time too. So most towns, even in the 15th century, had a town clock that would strike the hours, as I said, and by the 16th century they were quite common. Less common were the smaller pocket watches, which required very small springs to work the gears, and at that point in England they didn't have the skill set of the goldsmiths that were required to create those springs. Christina Juliet Faraday writes in Tudor Time Machines, Clocks and Watches in English Portrait, circa 1530 to 1630, she says, "Yet the need to import clocks increased their desirability. Linda Levi Peck has shown that luxury consumption emerged in the Tudor and Jacobean periods. Clocks are just one example of the goods imported for the developing consumer market. According to Peck, luxury was morally ambivalent in this period with its association of excess and Catholicism and the evils of social mobility. However, in contrast to other imported items, clocks had the enormous variety of additional associations, allowing them to be interpreted in terms other than decadent and trivial." So they were also very useful. So they were this luxury good that was being imported and part of this new rising luxury goods and consumer goods market. And they were acceptable not just because they were luxury and they were desirable, but they were also quite useful. So that would go along with the growing kind of Protestant work ethic, right? And that said, there are some very famous clocks that play a role in English history. For example, there's a golden clock that Henry VIII gave to Anne Boleyn when they were first married. And I linked to pictures of it in the show notes at englandcast.com. You can get the show notes. It's described by the Royal Collection Trust. It is, quote, "a gilt bronze wall-hung clock, the striking movement with a single steel hand in a square tabernacle case. The top pierced with foliage and scrolls containing the bell surmounted by a leopard holding a shield with the royal coat of arms and garter." Then there's also the very famous astronomical clock for the decoration of Hampton Court. Henry VIII had this put in around 1540. This is as he's rebuilding the palace after Wolsey's fall. Within the clock, there are 3 bells. The oldest is from 1478. And the clock is enormously complicated. I have a video of it in the show notes that you can see. There's a YouTube that Historic Royal Palaces put out. It shows the hour of the month, the day of the month, the position of the sun in the ecliptic, and interestingly, it shows the sun going around the Earth, right? Because this is before the heliocentric solar system became widely accepted. So we show the sun going around the Earth, the position of the sun, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the number of days that have elapsed since the beginning of the year, the phases of the moon, and also the hour which it crosses the meridian, which means that it will tell the time of the high tides in London. So because Henry VIII often traveled by barge, by the river, it was useful to know when these high tides were going to be as well, and so you could plan the best time to travel. So you can check out, again, englandcast.com for a video showing the astronomical clock at Hampton Court. I think it's also worth inserting here a quote by the historian and philosopher Lewis Mumford. He wrote in his 1934 classic, Technics and Civilization, that the clock was the key machine of the modern industrial age. He writes, quote, "The effect of the mechanical clock is more pervasive and strict. It presides over the day from the hour of rising to the hour of rest. When one thinks of the day as an abstract span on time, one does not go to bed with the chickens on a winter's night. One invents wicks, chimneys, lamps, gas lights, electric lamps, so as to use all the hours belonging to the day. Abstract time became the new medium of existence. Organic functions themselves were regulated by it. One ate not upon feeling hungry, but when prompted by the clock. One slept not when one was tired, but when the clock sanctioned it." So this is this change that we're going through in England during this period. The pocket watch, like I said, came out by 1511. And by the end of the century, you have pretty commonly in wealthy homes, these imported clocks and pocket watches, clocks you would hang on the wall. We see it starting to feature in portraits more and more as the century goes on. And even at that time, like I said, people were starting to question it and saying that they didn't want to be slaves to time. So of course, by the 1650s, then we have the pendulum clock, and that remains the most precise timekeeping machine for 3 centuries. In 1983, the Harvard economic historian David Landis wrote a book called Revolution in Time, Clocks and the Making of the Modern World, in which he argued that it was the clock that actually led to advanced capitalism. He wrote, the mechanical clock was self-contained, and once horologists learned to drive it by the means of a coiled spring, which happened in the 16th century, rather than a falling weight, it could be miniaturized so as to be portable, whether in the household or on the person. It is the mechanical clock that made possible, for better or for worse, a civilization attentive to the passage of time, hence to productivity and performance. So I think it's such an interesting thing to think about this change that was going on in England in this period, moving from this really sun-centered, very organic way of telling time, of telling what time of day it was, to something that was strict, that was rigid, that was according to the hours. And I should also add in here that clocks could be dangerous. In 1513, there was a laborer. He was named John Townsend, and he was holding an iron piece of a clock. When it slipped from his hand, it hit 5-year-old William Brett in the forehead, and the child died the next day. So, clocks, they change our perception of time, our perception of the way that time passes, and they can also be very dangerous.